to see you. We are reading now the Roswell Report, case closed. So we are going to get to the bottom of this story about what happened. Yesterday we read all about the balloons, the surveillance balloons and the test balloons and so forth. So we're going to read a little bit more today. We're going to get to the bottom of this because the truth is out there. So here is my shout out, is my baseball hat. Someone gave this to me. I have a whole drawer full of hats people have given to me. Apparently it has something to do with race car driving. I don't quite know what it means, but that's my hat. I wear it, a hat, when I'm outside to keep the sun off of my face. And this is my product placement, is pressure socks. I am going on a very long plane ride soon, and it is a good idea to wear pressure socks. I learned from experience when I went very far away, and you definitely want to wear pressure socks, no matter your age, even a young child. I would say it'd be a good idea, because if you fall asleep and you can sleep for 10 hours without waking up, you're going to wake up and your legs are going to be really like balloons. Do yourself a favor. Let's just get on with this story, because this one is just killing me. It's so good. We are up to part 1.3, high altitude balloon operations. Research has shown that many high altitude balloons launched from Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, were recovered in locations and under circumstances that strongly resemble those described by U.S. UFO proponents as the recovery of a flying saucer and alien crew. When these descriptions were carefully examined, it was clear that they bore more than just a resemblance to Air Force activities. It appears that some were actually distorted references to Air Force personnel and equipment engaged in scientific study through the use of high-altitude balloons. Good morning, baby world. Good morning. Glad that you're here. Since 1947, hey, good to see you. Since 1947, U.S. Air Force research organizations at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, have launched and recovered approximately 2,500 high-altitude balloons. The Air Force organization that conducted most of these activities, the Holloman Balloon Branch, launched a wide range of sophisticated and, from most perspectives, odd-looking equipment into the stratosphere above New Mexico. In fact, the very first high-altitude data-gathering balloon flight launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield, now Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, on June 4, 1947, was found by the rancher and was the first of many unrelated events now collectively known as the Roswell incident. Yes, yes, yes. On the threshold of space. In 1956, 20th Century Fox released On the Threshold of Space, a full-length motion picture based on Air Force area medical projects conducted at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, starring Guy Madsen, John Hodiak, and Dean Jagger. This drama chronicled the high-altitude balloon experiments of Project High Dive Excelsior and the high-speed track studies conducted by Colonel John P. Stapp. Filmed on location at Holloman Air Force Base, Air Force personnel, high-altitude balloons, aircraft, vehicles, and other equipment, including the actual anthropomorphic dummies responsible for sightings of aliens, were used in the making of this film. In an ironic twist, in 1990, the television program Unsolved Mysteries featured a segment on the Roswell incident. The program, hosted by actor Robert Stack, depicted a dramatized version of the claims of aliens, spaceships, and mysterious government recovery crews. Interestingly, A review of newspapers from 1956 announced the Hollywood premiere of On the Threshold of Space, listed Stack among the persons scheduled to attend at this star-studded event. Wow. High-altitude polyethylene research balloons. In 1946, a result of research conducted for Project Mogul, Charles B. Moore, a New York University graduate student working under contract for the U.S. Army Air Forces, made a significant technological discovery: the use of polyethylene for high-altitude balloon construction. Polyethylene is a lightweight plastic that can withstand stress of high-altitude environment that differ drastically from and greatly exceeded the capabilities of standard rubber weather balloons used previously. Moore's discovery was a breakthrough in technology. For the first time, scientists were able to make detailed, sustained studies of the upper atmosphere. Polyethylene balloons, first produced in 1947 for Project Mogul, are still widely used today for a host of scientific applications. High-altitude polyethylene balloons and standard rubber weather balloons differ greatly in size, construction, and utility. The difference between these two types of balloons historically has been the subject of misunderstandings, in that the term weather balloon is often used to describe both types of balloons. High-altitude polyethylene balloons are used to transport scientific payloads of several pounds to several tons to altitudes of nearly 200,000 feet. Polyethylene balloons do not increase in size and burst with increases in volume as they rise, as do standard rubber weather balloons. They are launched with excess capacity to accommodate the increase in volume. This characteristic of polyethylene balloons makes them substantially more stable than rubber weather balloons and capable of sustained constant level flight, a requirement for most scientific applications. The initial polyethylene balloons had diameters of only 7 feet and carried payloads of 5 pounds or less. As balloon technology advanced, payload capacities and sizes of balloons increased. Modern polyethylene balloons, some as long as several football fields, were on the ground, expand at altitude to volumes large enough to contain many jet airliners. Polyethylene balloons flown by the U.S. Air Force have reached altitudes of 170,000 feet and lifted payloads of 15,000 pounds. During the late 1940s and 50s, a characteristic associated with the large, newly invented polyethylene balloons was that they were often misidentified as flying saucers. During this period, polyethylene balloons launched from Holloman Air Force Base generated flying saucer reports on nearly every flight. There were so many reports that police broadcast radio and newspaper accounts of these sightings were used by Holloman technicians to supplement early balloon tracking techniques. Balloons launched at Holloman Air Force Base generated an especially high number of reports due to the excellent visibility in the New Mexico region. Also, the balloons flown at altitudes of approximately 100,000 feet were illuminated before the Earth during the period just after sunset and just before sunrise. In this instant, receiving sunlight before the Earth, the plastic balloons appeared as a large, bright objects against a dark sky. Also, with the refractive and translucent qualities of polyethylene, the balloons appeared to change color, size, and shape. The large balloons generated UFO reports based on their radar tracks. This was due to large metallic payloads that weighed up to several tons and echoed radar returns not usually associated with balloons. In latter years, balloons were equipped with altitude and position reporting transponders and strobe lights that greatly diminished the numbers of both visual and radar UFO sightings. One classic misidentification of a Holloman balloon that was mistaken for a UFO was launched on October 27, 1957. According to the following account, published in a widely distributed 1958 History of Air Force Balloon Operations, Contributions of Balloon Operations to Research and Development at the Air Force Missile Development Center, Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, 1947 to 1958. A suspected Holloman balloon was tracked both visually and by radar over London, England on November the 3rd, 1953. English accounts of the incident contain such statements as tremendous speed. Hello, good to see you, Wow Info. Good to see you back. English accounts of the incident contain such statements as tremendous speed, practically motionless, circular or spherical and white in color, emitting a reflecting or fierce light. Altitude was reported as 61,000 feet, and as no research balloon had recently been sent up from Britain, there was ample room for local saucer enthusiasts to claim the unidentified flying object as proof of their theories. Oh, good morning. Thank you. Wow information. As a much likelier explanation, however, is that this was really the balloon launch from Holloman on 27 October. High altitude balloon payloads. Over the years, payloads transported by high altitude polyethylene balloons range from simple radio transmitters to anthropomorphic dummies to sophisticated satellite components, and NASA interplanetary space probes. Many of these payloads, some which weighed many tons, were what someone would typically envision as being associated with a balloon. Examples of payloads flown in New Mexico by Air Force high-altitude balloons can be found on pages 52 and 53 at the end of this section. Research projects of the late 40s and 50s conducted at Holloman Air Force Base, which began with the Project Mogul flights in June 47, covered a wide spectrum of scientific research. One important experiment in space biology measured the effect of exposure to cosmic ray particles on living tissues. Other projects gathered meteorological data and collected air samples to determine the composition of the atmosphere. The first high-altitude photographic reconnaissance project, a forerunner of today's reconnaissance satellites, Project 119L, also used high-altitude balloon launched at Holloman Air Force Base. As early as May 1948, polyethylene balloons coated or laminated with aluminum were flown from Holloman Air Force Base and the surrounding area. Beginning in 1955, large numbers of these balloons were flown as targets in the development of radar-guided air-to-air missiles. Various accounts of the Roswell incident often describe thin metal-like materials that, when wadded into a ball, return to their original shape. These accounts are consistent with the properties of polyethylene balloons laminated with aluminum. These balloons were typically launched from points west of the White Sands Proving Ground, floated over the range as targets, and descended in the areas northeast of White Sands Proving Ground where the strange materials were allegedly found. In 1958, the first manned stratospheric balloon flights were made from Holloman Air Force Base. In 1960, balloon tests of components of the first U.S. reconnaissance satellites were also flown at Holloman Air Force Base. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, high-altitude balloons were used in support of Air Force and other U.S. government and university-supported research projects. Instrument testing of atmospheric entry vehicles for National Aeronautics and Space Administration, i.e. NASA, space probes is one proponent example. High-altitude balloons in America's first satellite. An illustration of the important contributions of the Holloman Air Force Base balloon branch and the necessity for rapid recovery of high-altitude balloon payload were evaluations of components of the first U.S. satellite-based reconnaissance system, codenamed Corona. The Soviet Union had already beaten the U.S. into space with the launch of the orbit of Sputnik 1 on October the 4th, 1957. The next achievement in the quest for space superiority were the physical recovery of a payload that had been in orbit. The Discoverer satellite, the sensor used in the Corona program, was to be propelled into orbit and then eject a capsule containing an American flag to enable the U.S. to claim this honor. The Discoverer program had been plagued by failure with 10 unsuccessful missions in 1959 and 1960. With the eyes of the nation watching and the Soviet testing a similar system, more failures could not be tolerated. To test the faulty components of the Discoverer U.S. Air Force high-altitude balloons at Holloman Air Force Base were determined to be the most expedient method of conducting the evaluations. In April 1960, Discoverer 11 on the launch pad of Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, was put into hold pending results of the balloon tests. The first test of the Holloman Air Force Base on April the 5th was unsatisfactory due to a parachute failure. On April the 8th, with pressure mounting, the balloon branch launched another balloon with the Discoverer capsule. This test, in which the capsule was dropped over the White Sands Missile Range and recovered immediately, was a total success. The results were relayed by telephone from the Balloon Control Center at Holloman Air Force Base to the launch pad at Vandenberg Air Force Base, where the countdown resumed. Despite the successful balloon drop, Discoverer 11 and Discoverer 12 were failures. Therefore, balloon testing continued throughout the summer of 1960. Finally, on August the 11th, 1960, Discoverer the 13 successfully ejected a capsule amid much fanfare. The first recovery of a man-made object that had orbited the Earth was accomplished. The first successful mission of an American satellite, made possible in part by Holloman Air Force Base high-altitude balloons, enabled the U.S. to beat the Soviets and claim the honor of the first space recovery by only 9 days. The Surveyor, Moon, Voyager Mars, Viking Mars, Pioneer Venus, and Galileo Jupiter spacecraft were tested by Air Force high-altitude balloons before they were launched into space. Viking and Voyager Mars space probes, examples of unusual payloads not likely to be associated with balloons, were qualification trials of NASA's Voyager, Mars, and Viking space probes. Both of these spacecrafts look remarkably similar to the classic dome-shaped flying saucer. In 1966, in 67, and in 1972, 8 of the UFO lookalikes were launched by the balloon branch from the former Roswell Army Airfield, now Roswell Industrial Air Center, New Mexico. The spacecraft were transported by Air Force balloons to altitudes above 100,000 feet and released for a period of self-propelled supersonic free flight prior to landing on the White Sands Missile Range. While the origins of the Roswell scenarios cannot be specifically traced to these vehicles, their flying saucer-like appearance and the fact that they were launched exclusively from the original Roswell incident location leaves an impression that perhaps these odd balloon payloads may have played some role in the unclear and distorted stories of at least some of the Roswell witnesses. Tethered balloons. Oh wow, here's some photographs. That's just unbelievable. Tethered balloons, the Holloman balloon branch, in addition to high-altitude research activities, also conducted low-altitude tether balloon flights. It appears that descriptions of these balloons may have become part of the Roswell incident. Most standard-shaped tether balloons are readily identified when near the ground or when the tether is visible. Other experimental tethered balloons are not so easily identified. During the 1960s, balloon branch personnel flew experimentally shaped tethered balloons from deep canyons of central New Mexico to a distant observer from a vantage point above the canyon rim, where the tether and ground anchors are not visible. an experimental tethered balloon might lead some persons to speculate as the oddly shaped balloon's origin and purpose. One design of a low-altitude tethered balloon may have inspired at least one account of an alien craft. The truth about the UFO crash at Roswell. The authors published a drawing of a crashed alien spaceship allegedly based on a drawing given to them by an anonymous witness. When the drawing is compared to a photograph of an experimental tethered balloon flown at Holloman Air Force Base in March of 1965, the similarities are undeniable. The tethered balloon and the NASA space probes are just two examples of the uncommon technologies that were flown in New Mexico by the Holloman Balloon Branch. And there's the picture. Balloon and payload recoveries. U.S. UFO theorists support their claim of an extraordinary occurrence in the New Mexico desert by describing mysterious U.S. military personnel operating a variety of vehicles and aircraft that always seem to arrive shortly after the crash of a flying saucer. When carefully scrutinized, the descriptions of the mystery crews, their equipment, methods, and the areas where the recoveries allegedly occurred in targeted high-altitude balloon recovery areas indicates that Holloman Balloon Branch activities were most likely responsible for the claims. To successfully recover high-altitude balloons, balloon recovery technicians regularly ventured far from Holloman Air Force Base. In most instances, the balloons and their scientific payloads were recovered from predetermined recovery areas. These regularly targeted areas located in Arizona, West Texas, and New Mexico included the areas surrounding Roswell. From 1947 to the present, the Roswell area has been the site of hundreds of balloon and payload recoveries, including those that carried anthropomorphic dummies. The regularly targeted areas were the result of the evolution of high-altitude balloon control techniques developed at Holloman Air Force Base. These techniques were based on meteorological, geographical, and operational conditions that exist in New Mexico. These factors, combined with ample amounts of skill and experience of balloon controllers at Holloman Air Force Base, determined the impact of Holloman high-altitude balloons. Many of the procedures used to position Air Force balloons are described in General Philosophy and Techniques of Balloon Control and the meteorological aspects of constant level balloon operations in the southwestern United States, both by Bernard G. Gildenberg. Gildenberg served as the Holloman Balloon Branch meteorologist, engineer, and physical science administrator from 51 to 81. During this period, Gildenberg, a recognized world expert in upper atmospheric wind patterns, pioneered methods to launch, control, track, and recover high-altitude balloons. Many of these methods are still used today by the U.S. Air Force and by research organizations throughout the world. Interaction with civilians. In several accounts, unsubstantiated allegations have been made that military personnel who retrieved equipment from rural areas in New Mexico intimidated and threatened civilians. Contrary to these charges, Balloon Branch personnel enjoyed good relations with the local community and often solicited their assistance in the area of the balloon or payload landing. In fact, featureless desert areas of the southeastern New Mexico near Roswell, the parachutes, payloads, the balloons themselves, good morning, good to see you, themselves and circling chase aircraft often drew crowds of curious onlookers from the local community. In fact, so many civilians were often present at a balloon or payload landing sites. The scene was described by longtime civilian Balloon Branch recovery supervisor Robert Blankenship as being like the circus coming to town. Yes, good morning. Good morning. Allegations that civilians were treated or told to forget what they saw are profoundly inaccurate. threats, intimidations, or other types of misconduct by balloon branch personnel would have served no purpose, since without the cooperation of local persons, many recoveries would not have been possible. Balloon recoveries were coordinated in advance with local law enforcement agencies. If a balloon or payload landed on private property, the owner could not be located, branch operating instructions dictated that the local sheriff or police must be contacted. In situations where local persons arrived at a balloon landing site before the recovery crews, they were simply asked to step back to allow recovery personnel to secure the balloon equipment. If these persons inquired as to the purpose of the balloon flight, they were informed by technicians that it was a U.S. Air Force scientific study and were given a telephone number at Holloman Air Force Base if they required additional information. At Holloman Air Force Base, individuals qualified to answer detailed questions responded to these inquiries. There was never a reason to mislead or threaten individuals who observed balloon operations. Relations with local citizens were good, and balloon branch personnel equipment and were a common sight to residents in areas with high incidence of balloon operations. Good morning. Let's see. In a few instances, situations arose when persons not familiar with the procedures and equipment used by balloon branch misunderstood their activities. Such misunderstandings occurred several times during the 70s and 80s, when recovery crews not only attracted the attention of local citizens while coordinating balloon recoveries, but also drew the attention of federal law enforcement agencies. Checks with the local sheriff revealed the trucks and circling aircraft in the desert near Roswell were part of a balloon recovery mission and not a drug smuggling operation. Apparently, balloon recoveries appeared to be something suspicious even to federal agencies. We are up to Chapter 1, Section 1.4. Comparison of witnesses' accounts to U.S. Air Force activities. Were they aliens or dummies? The question can be answered by comparing witness testimonies in the Air Force projects of the 1950s, High Dive and Excelsior. Both of these projects employed anthropomorphic dummies flown by high-altitude balloons and appeared to satisfy the requirements of the previously established research profile. A, an activity that, if viewed from a distance, would appear unusual. B, an activity for which the exact date was not likely to have been known because many dummies were dropped over a 6-year period, 1953 to 1959. C, an activity that took place in many areas of rural New Mexico. D, an activity that involved a type of aerial vehicle with dummies that had 4 fingers, were bald, and wore one-piece gray suits. E, an activity that required recovery by numerous military personnel and an assortment of vehicles that included a wrecker, a 6x6, and a weapons carrier. The testimony used in the following comparison and undocumented mixture of first-hand and second-hand recountings are the actual statements, not the interpretations of UFO proponents, that are present to prove the Earth was visited by extraterrestrial beings, and the U.S. Air Force has covered up this fact since 1947. This comparison is augmented by references to photographs whenever possible to illustrate the undeniable similarities between the descriptions provided by the witnesses and the equipment and methods employed by the Air Force projects. Crash Site 1. This summarized account is the basis for the alleged flying saucer crash site north of Roswell. The exact location is not known since the witness, Mr. James Ragsdale, in 2 separate sworn statements has described 2 different sites many miles apart. This account was excerpted from an interview with Mr. Ragsdale by author Donald Schmidt. A transcript of the complete interview is included in Appendix C. James Ragsdale. They was using dummies in those damn things. Testimony attributed to Ragsdale, who is deceased, states that he and a friend were camping one evening and saw something fall from the sky. The next morning, when they went to investigate, they saw a crash site. One part of the craft was kind of buried in the ground, and one part of it was sticking out of the ground. I'm sure that there was bodies, either bodies or dummies. The federal government could have been doing something they didn't want anyone to know what this was. They was using dummies in those damn things. They could use remote control, but it was either dummies or bodies or something laying there. They looked like bodies. They were not very long, not over 4 or 5 feet long at most. We didn't see their faces or nothing like that. We had just gotten to the site and the army and all was coming, and we got into a damn Jeep and took off. This testimony then describes an assortment of military vehicles used to recover the bodies. It was 2 or 3 6x6 Army trucks and a wrecker, and everything. Leading the pack was a 1947 Ford car with guys in it. It was 6 or 8 big trucks beside the pickup, weapons carriers and stuff like that. Ragsdale also said that before he left the area, he observed the military personnel gathering stuff up, and they cleaned everything all up. Assessment. In his testimony, Ragsdale made numerous references to equipment, vehicles, and procedures consistent with documented anthropomorphic dummy recoveries for Project High Dive and Excelsior. The repeated use of the term dummy and the witness' own admission that they was using dummies in those damn things, and I'm sure that was bodies, either bodies or dummies, leaves little doubt that he described was an anthropomorphic dummy recovery based on testimony attributed to this witness. The confusion could have resulted from the fact that these activities from a distance, if the witness was even a short distance from the odd-looking anthropomorphic dummies, it would be logical for him to believe when interviewed 35 to 40 years after the event that he thought they were dummies or bodies or something. Also, from some of the high-altitude drops, the dummies did not separate from the suspension rack and rode the rack to the ground without deployment of a parachute. If the parachutes of the dummies or parachutes of the rack assembly did not deploy, a common occurrence during the early dummy drops, then the arms and legs of the dummies were often separated from the body on impact. This may account for the witness' description of bodies not over 4 or 5 feet tall. Another portion of his testimony suggesting that the witness observed an Air Force high-altitude balloon and dummy recovery was the statement the federal government could have been doing something because they didn't want anyone to know what this was. They was using dummies in those damn things. They could use remote control. Balloon controllers use remote control to relay commands to the balloon control package to valve gas and drop ballast. The dummies themselves were also dropped from the suspension rack by remote control. The witness also described a balloon branch procedure that required the area of a balloon or payload landing to be restored to its original condition. It was evident in the statements they cleaned everything all up, and they began gathering the stuff up, thoroughly cleaning a balloon or dummy landing site and removing any debris deposited. There was standard procedure to maintain good community relations and avoid legal claims that could arise over property damage or livestock losses. Cattle were known to ingest scraps of polyethylene balloon materials that sometimes littered entire fields following a balloon failure or flight termination. The military vehicles described were also consistent with recovery and communication vehicles used during the 50s to retrieve anthropomorphic dummies and suspension racks. The witness statement, he saw a wrecker, a 6x6, a weapons carrier, a 47 Ford car, and a pickup. The wrecker was most likely a M342 5-ton wrecker that was assigned to the balloon branch for launch and recovery operations. Other vehicles described were also the type used to launch and recover anthropomorphic dummies. The 6x6 is likely reference to the M35 2.5-ton cargo truck weapons carrier, where the common name of the Dodge M37 3/4-ton utility truck. References to the pickup and a 47 Ford car were likely descriptions of other civilian military vehicles often present at high-altitude balloon launch and recovery locations. Crash Site 2, allegedly 175 miles northwest of Roswell. This purported flying saucer crash site is allegedly 175 miles northwest of Roswell in an area of New Mexico known as the San Agustin Plains. The contention that a flying saucer crashed at this location and was recovered by the U.S. military is supported by 3 principal testimonies, 2 secondhand and 1 firsthand. The secondhand accounts. These accounts were related by Mr. Vern Maltese and Miss Alice White Knight, who were acquainted with the alleged original eyewitness, Mr. Grady L. Barnett, who is deceased. Unless otherwise noted, the following statements appeared on footage used to prepare a video, Recollections of Roswell Part 2, by the Fund for UFO Research. Alice Knight. I don't recall the date. I don't remember whether it was before my husband and I were married or after. I don't recall the date. But he, the eyewitness, saw a UFO fall, and he got nearly to the site, but they got nearly up to the UFO, but it was close enough that you could see some creatures. He said they didn't look like human beings out there, and along came government cars and trucks. I guess it was government, it was a long time ago, and they told him to go on back and forget that they ever saw anything, and that's all I recall. Assessment. This brief testimony suggests that the witness did not know the date of this event. It also appears that the creatures were seen from a distance, as evidenced by the statement. They got nearly up to the UFO, but it was close enough that you could see some creatures. The testimony also seems consistent with a description of anthropomorphic dummies, as the witness stated they didn't look like human beings. Vern Maltese. Their heads were hairless, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair. The second-hand witness alleged that the eyewitness told him he observed beings from a flying saucer that had burst open, that were about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, very slim. Their heads were hairless, with no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair, with sort of a pear-shaped head. He also related that the beings were not exactly like human beings, similar but not exactly. He described that the hands of the beings were not covered and they only had 4 fingers. He also related that the clothing of the beings was one piece and gray in color. The witness concluded that as they, the witnesses, were just starting to look things over really closely, the military moved in and gave them a briefing to not say anything about it. Assessment. This description of events also indicates that the eyewitness apparently did not closely examined the scene and was just starting to look things over when the military arrived. As with the previous testimony from a distance, the dummies were likely to look, as described by the witness, not exactly like humans. Similar, but not exactly. The description of the flying saucer that had burst open is a likely description of the dummy suspension rack that was open on the sides. The detailed descriptions of the beings was as about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, very slim in stature. Their heads were hairless with no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair, with hands that were not covered and had only 4 fingers. Is a likely description of an Alderson Research Laboratories model anthropomorphic dummy. The head of the Anderson dummy was bald and the area of the eyebrows protruded but had no hair. Also, a distinguishing feature of the Alderson dummy, unlike the Sierra dummy, was that it had individual fingers not covered by gloves that were often damaged during the test, resulting in loss of fingers. Due to the secondhand nature of these accounts, even UFO theorists were not convinced that this incident actually occurred. Corroborating testimony of the first-hand witness was necessary to verify these claims. The first-hand testimony is examined next. Oh, goodness. Okay, the first-hand account. This testimony became part of the Roswell incident in 1990, following an episode of the television program Unsolved Mysteries. Following a dramatized recreation of the program, persons with information concerning this event were encouraged to call a special toll-free telephone number. From the outset, some UFO theorists were skeptical of this testimony due to the amount of detail provided from the witness, who was only 5 years old in 1947. In fact, UFO organizations sponsored a conference in February 1992 to evaluate testimony for authenticity. The witness was asked to take a polygraph examination, which he passed. Many UFO enthusiasts remained skeptical of the claims and denounced this testimony as no more than a fabrication. Unless otherwise noted, 2 sources of testimony attributed to witness have been used in this examination. Interviews used to prepare the video Recollections of Roswell Part 2 by the Fund for UFO Research, the Appendix C, and Crash at Corona by Don Berliner and Stanton Friedman. Passages from this book were used only when exact quotations of the witness were indicated. Gerald Anderson. I thought they were plastic dolls. I didn't think they were real. Anderson related that as a 5-year-old boy on an outing with his family in west central New Mexico, they stumbled upon the crash of some type of aerial vehicle. When the first saw the craft, he thought it was a blimp. According to Anderson, he didn't really get very close, but saw 4 bandaged crew members, and at first he thought they were plastic dolls. He also described attempts by persons in his party to communicate with one of the crew members. Soon after, other civilians arrived, some wearing pith helmets, followed by military personnel in an assortment of vehicles and aircraft, commanded by a red-headed captain. The military personnel, after screaming and hollering at the civilians, "This is a military secret," started a recovery operation of the alien craft and crew. Anderson also recalled that the military personnel threatened some of the civilians with imprisonment or death before escorting them out of the area. Assessment. Anderson's choice of the term blimp to describe the crash vehicle and dolls to describe the crew strongly suggests that a balloon with an anthropomorphic dummy payload was the foundation for the testimony. He also provided an abundance of supporting details that accurately describe vehicles, aircraft, equipment, and procedures used by the Holloman Air Force Base Balloon Branch to launch and recover anthropomorphic dummies. An aspect of this testimony that is not accurate is the alleged threats and intimidation of civilians by military personnel. The use of such heavy-handedness was not a tactic used by the Air Force. A careful review of official records and interviews with numerous persons who actively participated in and were responsible for the conduct of Air Force members on high-altitude balloon recovery operations revealed that these allegations were untrue. Additionally, the witness alleges that the military personnel were screaming and hollering, "This is a military secret." This statement might lead uninitiated persons to believe that the witness observed something highly classified, and that by telling everyone present that it was a military secret would somehow help it to remain so. However, logic dictates that if something was classified, screaming and hollering it was a secret would compromise it and not serve to protect its classification. This application of logic, combined with the fact that the launch and recovery of anthropomorphic dummies was unclassified, widely publicized, and often observed by local civilians, indicates that the witness recollections are in error. There was never a reason to disrespect, scream, holler, or forbid any person from talking about the launch or recovery of anthropomorphic dummies. The crew members. The statement, "I thought they were plastic dolls," seems an odd choice of words to describe an extraterrestrial being, as it is likely reference to an anthropomorphic dummy whose skin was made of plastic. This description is similar to that of the sole witness of the other crash site north of Roswell, who described the aliens as dummies. Other references provided by this witness further indicates that anthropomorphic dummies were the basis for these descriptions. The heads of the crew members were described as completely bald with no visible ears, just a rise and then a hole. This is an accurate description of Alderson Research Laboratory's model dummies that did not have hair and either had plastic ears molded to the head or a circular opening where a demountable ear or additional instrumentation was attached. The statement "they did not have a little finger," a detail very similar to the one provided by another witness, also appears to be a description of dummies manufactured by Anderson Laboratories that were often damaged during the balloon test, resulting in the loss of fingers. The assertion that they were all wearing one-piece suits, a shiny silverish gray color, trimmed in maroon-like cording, is a likely reference to a standard issue gray Air Force flight suit used to outfit dummies, and red duct tape used in the test that prevented air from filling the flight suit. The recollection that crew members had bandages on their bodies were likely references to tape and nylon webbing to prevent flailing of a dummy's arms and legs during test. A reference to a bandage around his, i.e. the crew member's midsection, and partially over his shoulder is likely reference to the standard B4 or B5 parachute with chest and shoulder straps worn by the dummies. The craft, in what appears to be a clear reference to a balloon, was that when he saw the crashed vehicle, he thought it was a blimp. Additional descriptions of cables that went from one kind of package of components to another kind of package in a metal box were likely references to the balloon control package that was positioned on top of the dummy suspension rack. A further reference to a balloon payload is a statement that on a hot New Mexico day, the crash vehicle was ice cold. It felt like it just came out of the freezer. This accurately describes a physical condition known as cold soaking, common to high-altitude payloads that had recently been exposed to sub-zero temperatures of the upper atmosphere. Military aircraft, the witness also described 2 aircraft of the same type used for anthropomorphic dummy recoveries as having been involved in the activity he witnessed. One aircraft was described as a C-47 and another as an observation aircraft, a high-winged aircraft. These were a C-47 and an L-20 aircraft used extensively by the balloon branch during the 50s for tracking and recovering anthropomorphic dummy balloon flights. This testimony also described aircraft that were typically overhead during a recovery and an established procedure of landing on a rural road or in a field to reach isolated balloon launch or recovery locations. Military vehicles, numerous military vehicles, several of which were described by other witnesses as having been at the other crash site north of Roswell, were also described. Witnesses at the 2 different sites described a wrecker and a 6x6, both of the type used for anthropomorphic dummy recoveries. The account also described 2 vehicles unique to the balloon branch that were used for the majority of the high altitude balloon recoveries during the mid to late 50s. The witness described a Jeep-like truck that had a bunch of radios in it. There was a guy sitting in there wearing earphones and was talking on the radio. This is a likely description of a Dodge M37 3/4-ton utility truck known as a weapons carrier that had been specially modified to carry radio equipment for balloon recovery operations. The Holloman Air Force Base balloon branch modified these vehicles in 1953, ruling out the possibility that the witness observed them in 1947, when such vehicles were not available to organizations performing balloon operations. The other vehicle described and used by the balloon branch were military ambulances. During the mid-1950s, the balloon branch modified 3 M43 3/4-ton ambulances for use as balloon recovery and communications vehicles. These vehicles were used for anthropomorphic dummy launch and recovery missions to relay messages to a circling recovery aircraft in the Balloon Operations Center at Holloman Air Force Base. The witness also described a trailer with a motor on it, like a generator. This is a likely description of a 1.5 ton cargo trailer with an MB-19 50 kilowatt diesel generator. These generators were used primarily on balloon launch sites during the 50s and 60s. Balloon branch procedures. Descriptions of military personnel stretching stuff out on the ground, dragging stuff out of trucks is a likely description of a balloon launch procedure that required the fragile polyethylene balloon and protective ground cloth to be removed from a launch vehicle and laid out on the ground prior to inflation. Another procedure described by the witness was an apparent reference to a balloon recovery practice of recording the names of civilians who observe high-altitude balloon recoveries. The witness stated that military personnel took everybody's name and everything, which was a procedure to ensure payment of a $25 reward to persons who assisted in the recovery. The procedure was also necessary to settle future claims of property damage caused by the balloon payload or recovery vehicles. Wow, well, we will stop there today. The next part of this is called summary, and we'll read that. Probably have time tomorrow. So that is just very, very eye-opening. Yeah, who knew? I mean, we have this balloon thing going on now. This is the Roswell Report. Case closed. That's what it says. Case closed. We have that balloon thing going on now. If you've noticed, there was a couple over the I think there were 3. There was one they shot down over the ocean, and they claim it was from China. And then I saw another report. It wasn't very prominent in the news, but there were other countries throughout the world that have claimed balloons over their countries that they did not shoot down, that if it's over a populated area, you just have to let it float by. My only hope is that these balloons aren't full of radioactive material that when shot down would kill us, or some sort of dirty bomb, or something that a virus or anything that as it's floating by, it's dispersing, even just radioactive dust that will float its way to the ground. It'll really kill us all, but it'll slowly kill us all, slowly. Starting with your thyroid. And then here is my shout out, is my baseball hat. I like to wear a hat when I'm out in the sun. Someone gave me this. I don't know what it means. Someone gave it to me. I get a lot of compliments. I don't know why. Maybe I should try to sell it. Apparently it's a sought after thing, but I think it has something to do with race car driving. I don't know, because I don't really follow NASCAR. And this is my product placement. Is pressure socks. I am going, oh, it's made in America. Whoop, whoop. I didn't know. I bought these at the pharmacy at CVS, and I was just walking past. I said, let me go in and see if they have pressure socks, because I did have a hard time finding them. I went to several stores, and they had some for like $60, and I'm like, I'm not spending that much money on a pair of socks. And or they were too much pressure. They were like maximum pressure for someone that has diabetes or embolism problems. And I said, I don't really need that. And that's actually dangerous. You need a prescription, or you need your doctor to recommend them. Even though you can buy them over the counter, I wasn't going to spend $60. So I ran home and I got my CVS card. I had to dig it up because I don't usually buy stuff at the pharmacy because their prices are too high. And I went back and they were $15 was the price tag. And I thought, well, $15, but I couldn't find them anywhere else. So I said, I'll just get them. But the cashier scanned my CVS card and they took $10 off. So these were only $5. So I went away very happy and thanking God that I went home. I took the trouble to go back home and get my CVS card. And so there you have it. Maybe I should buy stuff at CVS more often. They're not usually inexpensive. CVS is usually like a convenience store, and which is another thing about CVS. So there was that news story of these Americans that went to Mexico to buy their pharmaceuticals, but they got kidnapped and 2 of them got killed. And I'm yelling at the TV going, why didn't you just go around the corner to CVS? Like, you don't have a CVS in your neighborhood? Okay. Anyway, that's that. Come on. I hope you have a wonderful day. It is already Wednesday. Goodness, time goes so quickly. And we are reading the Roswell Reports, case closed. I did not know all of this about. This is the first time I'm reading this. I never really paid much attention to it. I missed out on a lot of those, like X-Files and those shows. I met Bud Hopkins several years ago. He's an abstract expression, or he was an abstract expressionist, an artist, and I met him just because I'm an artist, and that I had the opportunity to meet him. I didn't know who he was until I met him, and he was telling me all about his experience of having seen an extraterrestrial, and then he interviewed so many people about their experiences. There was a flying saucer seen in New York City over the Brooklyn Bridge. I met another artist, his name is Sal Mandela, who also saw the UFO and had other UFO experiences. And Bud Hopkins wrote many books about UFO experiences that were made into movies. I tried to find some Bud Hopkins books. They weren't at the library I go to. I will probably have to order them. We'll see. I'll try to order them. I think it would be fascinating to read them. I've never read them. Even after I met Bud Hopkins, I didn't bother to read the books because I was more interested in him as an artist. And as well as Sal Mandela, I collaborated with on a few projects. I didn't really. Sal Mandela draws a lot of comic book characters, famous for Superman and so forth. But I didn't read the books. I might have read one, I don't remember, but I should get some of those books and read them for YouTube because they are fascinating. It would be interesting. So that is that. And I, myself, I've never seen a UFO that I know of. I've seen strange things in the sky, but it ended up being either a drone or a helicopter or something that was explainable. It's not that I don't believe in UFOs. I believe because I've met people that believe. And I believe for them. It's like ghosts. I don't think I've ever seen a ghost. I had a house, an old house once, that things would always happen, but I feel like things were easily to be explained. There were actual reasons why, like things would fall off the shelf all of a sudden. Just all of a sudden, I would sit there and see something fly off the shelf, and I'd be like, really? I don't know. The house wasn't level, and I don't know if it was seismic activity or what, but I moved. I got out of that place. I was glad to leave. Not because of the ghost, but because it just wasn't my home. It didn't feel like my home, but anyway. I hope you have a great day. Let me know you were here so I can visit your channel. Give me a kiss. All right, you take care, friends.